If you've got a question, the voices of resin are here. Oh, PlastChicks.
PlastChicks is an SPE sponsored podcast. Good
Hey.
morning.
Oh, good morning to you.
Look at this. It's a fine Friday morning, which is great since these episodes are released on a Friday. So we're really, the listener has no idea what Friday we're coming to you from. We could be doing this live. You'd have no idea. We're not.
Well, yeah. We might be a little. If you're doing
awful punchy.
We might get this next part a little bit more, in tune together. But I'm Mercedes Landazuri,
and I'm Lynzie Nebel.
And with our powers combined, we are
PlastChicks,
the voices of resin.
And we are coming to you with my first postpartum episode, I believe, unless we recorded one and I was in a sleep deprived stupor. Either way, I've had 7 hours of sleep and a cup of coffee, so I am ready for this. And my kids are with the nanny, so we're all
Congratulations on your fourth child not named after me.
I know. Well, when you have 4 boys in a row, it's very hard to name them Mercedes.
I told you, go with Mercedes for middle name, Paul for the first name, so you can call your baby Polymer for short. I don't know why you wouldn't do it.
As an aside, my husband did actually want to name our baby Ethylene, just Ethylene. And I was like, no, it's not on the table. It's not an option. I can't be that committed to the bit. And thankfully we never had a girl. So this was not not up for debate.
So back to who we are and what we do. So this is the PlastChicks podcast. It's released the first Friday of every month, where we get your podcasts. And we created this podcast 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, like first kid, I think.
Yeah, Lynzie and I met on a committee meeting for Society of Plastics Engineers, inspiring plastics professionals
and plastics.
And we wanted to create a more public voice for other demographics in the industry, and also just to learn more from everyone in the industry and industry adjacent. So we have people from all points in their career, all walks of life, several continents, a few continents.
Yeah, we're checking off continents. No one from Antarctica yet. We'll work on it.
Yeah. And thanks for listening. And today we have a wonderful guest on. Very, very excited to introduce Kate Davenport, who is the co-president at Eureka Recycling. Kate, thanks so much for joining us on the pod today.
Yeah, it's exciting. I'm looking forward to it.
So, Kate, I know Mercedes got to spend some time with you at a recent event, and I was not allowed because I was I was pregnant with said baby. So can you, for myself and for our listeners, just give us a little bit about your background, a little bit about Eureka, and let us know what's going on.
Yeah, sure. So I have been doing sustainability work for 20 plus years, I think. I think now I'm old enough, I don't even know the exact math anymore. And so, my journey on this actually started right after graduating from college. I was really interested in international relations, and I was at the UN World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. This was in 2002. I was at an event, and there was a display there from the IUCN, which is a coalition of scientists across the world that work on sustainability. And they had a bunch of exhibits around entrepreneurs in Southern and Eastern Africa that were starting businesses that both generated income and also did something around natural resource management or sustainability. And there was an entrepreneur named Peter that was harvesting invasive species out of the river and turning it into paper. And it was in that moment that I was like, you can both address environmental issues and generate income at the time, because I think for so long,
Yeah.
Environmental protection has been pitted against economic development. And so that honestly, I never actually got to meet Peter, but that actually kind of started off my journey. And I started working with a very small non-governmental organization doing environmental micro enterprise development in Tanzania. So working with very low income populations on how to generate income and that in a way that's sustainable. And that got me really interested in the waste issue. I interacted with a lot of farmers that were taking food waste and composting it and then using that as soil amendments for their agricultural purposes. And it was like, wow, we produce a lot of waste in the United States and just throw it away. So that concept of waste really I gravitated towards. And I think a lot of the rest of the world, particularly that's lower income, sees waste as a resource, not just something that goes away. And so that got me really interested in waste issues. And I was like, I need to try to figure out how to address this issue in my own backyard, not in other people's communities. And so I helped start the first compost collections business in Washington, D.C. in the mid-2000s. So at this point, like food waste composting was really not something that was happening. And so I found a guy that had bought a truck and was like picking food waste up from Whole Foods and the Four Seasons and restaurants. And so really got into the issue. And I think once you get into waste, it's pretty hard to get out of it. It becomes a pretty fascinating part of our society that nobody really talks about until like the last 5 years. So that was kind of the start of my journey there.
So you said, sir, you said that you developed the very first compost collection program in Washington.
Yeah.
You're a celebrity.
I don't know about that.
Listen, it's going on our podcast, celebrity approved.
I wasn't the, there's actually the person that started it, his name is Walker Lunn. He started it and I joined him probably a couple months later. But yeah, we were in our mid-20s and had a truck driving around in the middle of the night picking up food waste. I learned a lot. I was stopped by the Secret Service at one point. Picking up at the World Bank, which is near the White House, and they were like, "Who is this young woman driving this dump truck around full of food waste?"
You're like, "Don't worry about it."
I was like, "I think I'm fine. You want to get in?" They were like, "No, we're fine."
Were they testing for like methane levels and things like that?
Yeah. That was very early on when people were starting to think about the climate impact of food waste. When food waste goes into the landfill, it produces methane. And that is actually a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon. And so people were starting to think about how do we compost this food waste to address climate change, but also like compost food waste can be turned into compost, and that has value from a agricultural perspective. So I started it in the food waste side of things, made a lot of mistakes, learned a lot about collections in the waste industry. And then I fell in love and moved to Minnesota in the middle of winter.
That is some big love there.
Yeah, that was some big love.
The warmest part, stop and take us to the coldest places.
Right.
Oh,
Exactly.
There we go.
And was introduced, found out about this organization, Eureka Recycling, and I was like, I want to work there. And so was lucky enough to start working there about 12 years ago now. And started in the business development side of things and then took over as co-president about 7 years ago. So yeah, that's kind of been the journey. So I've been in this for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So you said that that this gentleman, Peter, what was his last name? Did you mention in Johannesburg?
Oh, I can't remember his last name. I just remember
Peter. We'll call him Peter.
Yeah.
So that you recognize that then from him that that you could do this, but then also make money at it, and yet Eureka Recycling is a nonprofit, and one of only 4 nonprofit MRFs in the United States. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So Eureka's been around for about it's been a little over 20 years. We actually came out of a community-based organization that was part of starting the recycling program in the city of St. Paul in the 80s. And so Eureka spun out of that to actually kind of take on the operations in 2001. And at the time, the reason for the nonprofit status was, recycling really started as a community-based thing, right? Communities coming together and saying, why are we throwing aluminum cans and paper in the trash? And then that led to those grassroots efforts led to cities starting to offer recycling as a city service kind of in the 80s and 90s. And then you started to see the large waste companies get into recycling. And so at that point in time, it felt like there was really a need for a mission-based organization to be doing recycling from a mission perspective, not purely from a profit perspective. And so that was kind of why Eureka had started as a not-for-profit. And I'll say that, being a nonprofit doesn't mean we don't run a business. It just means we don't have shareholders. And so our proceeds go back into our mission, into our education work, our policy work, and our advocacy work. So a little bit about how we're structured. We have two, what we would call social enterprises. One is a recycling collections business. So we contract primarily with municipalities to pick up the recycling every week that residents put out in their carts. So we got, 30 trucks and 40 drivers out every week picking up recycling. Primarily, again, our customer is the municipality in that sense. They contract with us to provide that service. And then we have a material recovery facility, or MRF. So I'm sure we'll talk about the MRF a little bit more. So that's where all that material gets put in the cart, it comes to the MRF, and we sort it back into its original packaging category. So cardboard and glass and aluminum and different types of plastic, and sell those to manufacturers that will turn it into new product. And so we also contract municipalities to provide that service, as well as other haulers in the marketplace. So we run those as businesses. If you looked at our books, it would look very much like a for-profit. We're not subsidizing those with grants, for example. We're competing in the marketplace, and that's on purpose, right? Our mission is to demonstrate that waste is preventable. And so we want to try to show that in how we do our business. And so we need to be operating in the existing market environment to talk about what's working and what's not working and what we need to do to change it. And so we leverage our experience in those operations to advocate for policy change, to push brands for better practices, to educate the community and different stakeholders on what needs to happen. Because recycling, at the end of the day, why are we doing recycling, right? The goal is not actually recycling. The goal is to decrease natural resource extraction, to cut down less trees and to extract less oil from the ground to make plastics, for example, or mining bauxite to make aluminum. And there are climate change benefits to that. There's human health benefits to that. There are pollution benefits to that. So we're really trying to utilize our understanding of what's happening in terms of recycling to advocate for it to have further benefit, to increase those benefits, for example, and also to be real where it isn't the solution. So I'm sure we'll talk about that more.
I feel like this conversation can really spiral in a whole lot of directions, and I'm not sure we will fit everything we want into. One of the things you mentioned, the first part of Eureka is, kind of doing the recycling collections for the municipalities. I'm coming at this from, I'm not in necessarily the sustainability space like Mercedes is, but obviously I'm team recycle here. But one of the things I always hear is kind of the not complete outsider, but semi-outsider, is that municipalities are very difficult to kind of fit recycling or collections into. Do you find that that's a problem, and do you have to kind of work within their structure, or do you kind of make them come to your table, I guess?
It's a dance.
Okay.
It's a dance. The history of waste is actually important to understand in terms of where we are right now, right? So if you look across the United States, it's municipalities. I think there's like 30,000 municipalities. I might be wrong about that number, but that across the United States, and that's who really manages waste. And the history of that is at the turn of the 20th century, waste became a sanitation issue. So think about New York City and horses everywhere, and what are you going to do with the manure, et cetera. And there were cholera outbreaks. So municipalities took on waste management from a sanitation perspective. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the history of why municipalities hold that responsibility for managing waste. And so at the end of the day, it's a service that they're providing to residents, to the local taxpayer, right? And so they're not necessarily doing it from a sustainability perspective. Again, they're doing it from a service and a sanitation perspective as their primary objective. Now, over the last 20 years, you've seen municipalities integrate their own sustainability goals. I mean, I think cities are the front line in a lot of ways for addressing climate change, for example. But again, primarily, they want that stuff picked up every week and off the streets at the end of the day. And so, so you're always trying to kind of find what's the mutually beneficial way to approach something. I think one of the things, I might be going on a tangent here, but this is relevant. So, I mean, as you all know, the issue of plastics pollution and the role of recycling and addressing that has really exploded in the public discourse in like the last 5 years. And there were kind of two things that we saw happen that resulted in why that's kind of exploded. And one was, about 5-6 years ago, we just started seeing more press, National Geographic articles, et cetera, about plastics pollution in the ocean, right? The big gyre in the Pacific, or the pictures of the turtle with the, bottle in its stomach or
that
whatever.
Turtle, yeah.
That turtle haunts us.
That turtle haunts us. So there just was more attention to the plastics issue. And thus that brought up like, well, how do we deal with this? Who's responsible for addressing this issue? What's the role of recycling? Many of us have been recycling for decades and being like, well, is this not working? Why is the plastic still ending up in the ocean? And at the same time as that, there was a kind of geopolitical thing that happened where China announced a policy called National Sword in about 2018. Mm-hmm. And at that point in time, about 30 to 40% of the recycling collected in the United States was going through material recovery facilities and then being shipped to China to markets to be turned into new product. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of different reasons for that. This was happening particularly on the West Coast. So if you think about it, you had shipping containers coming over with our iPhones and all the things that we buy manufactured in China, and they were empty going back. So it was cheaper to ship recycling in those empty shipping containers going back than, say, into the middle of the United States where a lot of the recyclers are. Also, China was where most of the manufacturing was happening in the world. So that's where the demand was for old cardboard to make new cardboard boxes, for example. And China was hungry for it. What ended up happening was there was a lot of recycling being sent to China that was pretty dirty and contaminated. And so China basically said, we're not taking this anymore. We're done. And they shut the doors overnight. And so particularly on the West Coast, there was just nowhere for recycling to go. There was a lot of news and press around, piles of recycling not going to the landfill. And so again, brought up this question of what's happening to recycling. Is it really a solution? And one of the things that was revealed, is kind of the curtain was pulled back, was there were a lot of plastics going to China that were honestly being burned. And what had happened over kind of 20 years was municipalities were incentivized to add as much material as possible to their recycling program, right? That makes all of us here feel good. The more stuff we can throw in there, we feel good. They feel like they're providing a good service to their residents, et cetera. And China was willing to take all of that plastic and pull out the good stuff, and they were burning the rest. This was particularly true for plastics 3 through 7. I'm assuming I can use some of the resin code numbers
yeah.
on this
Yeah.
podcast.
If not, check out our show notes.
Yeah. So there were fairly good domestic markets for number one and number two, but all that other stuff there really wasn't. And the reality was they were pulling out the number fives, the polypropylene, and the rest was getting burned. And so it was this moment that was like, that's not really recycling. Just because we can send it somewhere to somebody, if it's not actually being turned into new product, that's not achieving the goals of recycling, right?
Right.
But municipalities had been incentivized to get service providers that would accept all plastic. They were winning contracts because they could accept all plastics. They had places to send it in China. And then this was kind of the like, it blew up, the moment of truth, what's really happening here. So I think that's a good example too, where like municipalities aren't doing the due diligence necessarily on what's really happening. They're trusting the market. And the market was saying this is getting recycled. So I think that was an example of kind of where we didn't have the right checks and balances in the system to make sure we were doing recycling for the reason that we all put stuff in the cart every week.
Right.
And I think that this also led to a lot of the skepticism now that we are facing with recycling, right? Lynzie and I always text each other when we find something on social media, then we're trying not to spiral out of control and anger.
I don't want to comment on those posts, but my inner voice tells me to comment.
You know what? So what's your go-to fun fact when you meet a recycling skeptic that things, oh, it doesn't matter that what I put in the bin, like none of it's getting recycled anyway. It's all live.
Or they're quoting that new like 9% of plastic gets recycled or whatever that.
Yeah. It's, it's interesting. I stopped telling people in the rest of my life that I work in recycling because then I'm inevitably like talking about it at a soccer game, and I'm like, I just want to watch my kid.
All I want to do is talk about recycling.
I mean, I do, but sometimes I just want to watch my kid play soccer.
Yeah.
Fair. That is a go button.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I cannot tell you how many people find out I'm in recycling and they say, I need you to settle a dispute in my household between me and my husband. Do I need to wash out the peanut butter jar? It's like always the question that everybody asks.
That's like my husband and I always have that debate, and I'm like, listen, I talk to people who know this, and he's like, yeah, but
like my wife still questions me, and I'm like, I literally run a recycling.
Oh wow! Oh, that's just
the disrespect.
Come on. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of distrust in it. And there's a lot that we need to do as an industry to rebuild that trust. That 9% number is interesting. That 9% number is true about all plastics that's been created. What comes through a recycling program, like when we think of a recycling program, your municipal recycling program, is plastics packaging, which is only a portion of all the plastics produced in the world, right? And so I think that's where I go, is to try to kind of pull it apart. It's hard though, and it's complicated and it's nuanced, and we live in a society that's all about the quick news media hit. So I think we're still trying to figure out how we get people's attention on the complexity of this. So if you look at plastic packaging that goes in your bin, most of that does actually get recycled. So there are layers to that, right? So first off,
well, if they are layers, they might not be. No, I'm just kidding. little recycling, multi-layer joke.
I was gonna say, wow.
Oh,
really going for the joke.
That was really good. Yeah. So there's like the 9% is, what you put in your bin is only a portion of what that 9% is counting. That's counting like, car
Medical
parts and medical waste and industrial stuff. I mean, plastics is everywhere, in so many parts of our life. And then from that, if you look at just plastics packaging, it's true that we only collect about 20 to 30% of the plastic packaging that's out there. It's not getting in the cart, which is different than how much of what's in the cart actually gets recycled. Does that make, and I think once you start digging in, it gets really complicated and hard to keep people's attention. And it's true. There were some recyclers that weren't recycling the plastic that they were getting. But the majority of PET and high density polyethylene, which is the majority of the plastics that the recycling, residential recycling does get recycled and recycled by domestic markets. But, that's like multiple layers from the 9%. But we try to do a lot of work with different stakeholders to try to help them understand the layers there.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk about because at the end of the day, like you said, it's still a business. You're bringing in this material, and that comes at a cost to your company, right? But you also then have to turn around and sell it. So can you talk about navigating that and how to identify different markets to sell those materials into, right? My first love in plastics was polystyrene, right?
And I thought it was me.
Okay, well, I feel like maybe a year after I fell in love with polystyrene. Yeah. But and it broke my heart trying to figure out even internally, like our small amount of polystyrene waste at the company, how to get that recycled. And there really wasn't a market for it. So even though some of these materials are technically recyclable, most of the materials you do take in are recyclable, but you don't have markets for all of them to sell into.
Yeah. So, I think what's interesting about recycling is to your point, Mercedes, like technically anything can be recycled, right? If you can get it all sorted into that particular type of polymer, but there has to be a market for it, and the economics for collecting and sorting it all have to line up. And those are a lot of complicated things that have to come together. So, we're selling, about 13 different global commodities. What we're selling is really different global commodities, right? And so we have to have manufacturers that want to buy them and turn them into new product. So we need paper mills that want to buy cardboard to turn it into cardboard, for example. So we need markets for the plastic that we collect and sort, and we need sustained markets, right? I think we saw this with polystyrene. Like, we've been very vocal about never accepting polystyrene. There's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the primary ones is like there aren't stable markets for that material, right? And like the one little pop-up, we're going to take it and turn it into picture frames, like that's not a sustainable market. And does that market pay us what it costs to sort that material? And polystyrene is challenging too, because it breaks apart and basically just like goes everywhere. So it's very hard to aggregate that material into one stream. So yeah, you need consistent markets. And so, when we look at adding material, we want to know that there are stable markets out there, and the pricing has to be such that it covers our operating costs and the capital investments that we need to make to collect and sort that material. And there's often a disconnect. And that is the issue right now with flex film packaging.
And I think, even to that point, a lot of people designing, new products or, aren't educated on, what materials can be recycled or how they could be using PCR or anything like that. Because I spoke with a very, I want to say lovely gentleman. We'll all know what that means, who was designing some products in the beauty industry. And he was telling me how the material he was using was not recyclable. And so he didn't have to worry about it. And I was like, I'm like, everything you're saying is wrong from top to bottom. Like, you could be designing something that's using recycled material, or you could be using material that is like you are using material that's recyclable. Again, whether the market matches that or whatever, that's a different issue. But, he had no idea. And he also told me I was very wrong. But I believe I did send a heated email to Mercedes after that conversation.
Yeah. And I think honestly that gets down, we see that too. And we do tours for packaging designers to help them understand the end of life. That's often never part of the curriculum or it's not in the incentives for them when they're designing packaging. It's not part of the equation. I think this gets down to fundamentally why we think there needs to be public policy. Like, this is an urgent issue that we need to figure out, and we need public policy to help set the guardrails and the rules of the game, because there are honestly not enough incentives in the market to necessarily designed for recycling at the pace that we need to do that to address this problem. And so we really need policy to do that. And that's why we're a very strong supporter of extended producer responsibility, right? We've now seen that pass in 4 states in the US. And it's that, going back to what I was talking about before, historically, it's been municipalities that have been responsible for packaging waste from the perspective of sanitation and keeping streets clean. That's who's paid for recycling. We need to shift that responsibility to the people that produce it so that they understand from the design stage all the way down what they need to do from a design perspective to make recycling work. So we need to shift that responsibility away from the municipality towards the producer.
Yeah, we're talking about extended producer recyclability, and also, how have I completely agree with you on policy. We definitely need better. I always say hashtag bills, not bans. I think I mentioned that at the conference, right?
Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Skidmore, and I'd like to share with you SPE's Certificate in Leadership. Have you heard about the program? In this program, participants learn about essential leadership and management principles, such as organizational culture, financial intelligence, strategic planning, innovation, and more. But they not only learn the topics, they learn how to apply strategies and tools to their team, their department, and organization. I invite you to visit forspe.org to learn more about the Certificate in Leadership and to apply for an upcoming cohort.
So what I was going to say is how have the commitments that some brands have made, we've seen them 2025, like everybody's on target or not on target. Everybody's going to be missing their goals, their PCR goals. But we have seen these brands make these increasing commitments to use PCR. How has that impacted you? Do you think that that's an effective part of the strategy?
Yeah, I think fundamentally voluntary commitments will not get us there, that we do need public policy. And at the same time, we've been engaged with the US Plastics Pact, and we sit in many industry circles that those commitments, I think, have created awareness around where the opportunities and challenges are, and started the conversation. So, 5-6 years ago, most of the brands were firm opposers to extended producer responsibility or recycled content mandates. I think because of their voluntary commitments, they've begun to understand how the system works, what the challenges are, and recognize, we do need policy to kind of reset all of this to get us to these goals. I think what's been really interesting is I'm getting more calls from procurement departments now than I am from the sustainability folks, which to me is actually success, right? Because at the end of the day, it's the procurement folks that make the daily decisions around, are we using recycled content or not?
Yeah, and they're being dictated to kind of by the engineers who are hopefully starting to think in this line.
They're incentivized, I think, and the reality of where we are, and right now is a perfect moment to kind of show what's not working, but recycled plastic is competing with virgin plastic, right? So if you look at the price of recycled content plastic, it's highly volatile, and it basically follows what the price of oil and natural gas is, right? Because that's where virgin plastics come from. And so procurement folks, if the price of, virgin PET or virgin polyethylene drops because of what's happening in terms of the natural gas or oil markets, then that's going to put downward pressure on recycled commodity fees. So, PET is a great example, right? Like this time last year, we were, 30, 40 cents a pound. Right now I'm getting a penny a pound.
Whoa!
If you look at the commodity market indexes, that's what you're seeing. Just falling off the cliff. And if you ask kind of what's going on, that there's been dumping of virgin material from European and Middle Eastern markets on the US market. And if you're a procurement officer and your charge is to get the cheapest input, what are you going to do? Right? So unless there's policy like a recycled content mandate or something that levels the playing field for everybody, it's pretty hard to get a corporation to leave, to pay that much more for recycled content. So that kind of massive commodity swings is what makes recycling really challenging. And that's, again, I think where we need policy to kind of change the incentives in the system. But yeah, Mercedes, you had that reaction, right? That's a huge swing in value.
I remember, when we met and you were giving the tour, I think you had said like the year before that it was at 9 cents and that felt low. And now you're saying a penny. That's I don't know. I would have a lot of difficulty sleeping at night.
Yeah. I mean,
trying to run a business without that stability.
The way that we try to kind of stabilize that is we have revenue share agreements with our customers. So we set a processing fee, right? Because it's expensive to run a MRF. You've got people and a lot of capital investment, and obviously that cost doesn't change on a day-to-day basis. And so we set a processing fee. And if the value of the material that we're selling is above that processing fee, we share that revenue with our customers. And if it's below, then they have to make up the difference. And that's part of how we stabilize those commodity swings. But that's still challenging, right? Because they only have a certain tolerance for what their processing fee will be. So again, this goes back to extended producer responsibility and having those that make the packaging be responsible for the system in a different way. So yeah, but it's a hard business to run with that kind of those kind of commodity swings. The other thing that we're seeing, natural high density polyethylene. We talked about this, Mercedes, when you were here. We really started to see some stabilization with that material. Actually, had started to become more valuable than aluminum, which we had never seen before. And I would attribute that to the commitments that brands were making. Natural high density polyethylene, so like your milk jugs, is some of the easiest material to recycle because it's clear. And so, there's not as much processing that you need to do with that. And you have more ability to take that and put it into a food grade application, for example. So that was kind of the material we saw a lot of folks going after to meet their recycled content commitments. And there were a lot of people saying, wow, this is awesome. It started to stabilize. We think that it's now separated. Its price is kind of separated from virgin. This is really exciting. And then I'd say the last few months, we've started to see that price decrease significantly. And what we're hearing is because there's been a lot of wide spec polyethylene pellets dumped on the market. And so again, the procurement folks, at the end of the day, what are, price is what their incentive is.
Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah. I'm not blaming the procurement folks. Again, it's a system.
We can. This is an aggressive podcast.
We can blame the procurement folks. But
sorry, everyone in procurement.
Tech service lab people, certainly. Well, we will all blame procurement.
We'll blame everyone.
But I think there's some exciting moments too, right? Like, some of the executives, the C-suite at Coke, some of their executive pay is now tied to meeting that recycled content commitment, right? So we're seeing some shifts that may filter down to the procurement team in terms of how they think about what to balance when they're purchasing material. So there's a lot of challenges in the system, but I think we've never seen this kind of momentum in terms of all the stakeholders starting to come to the table to try to figure this out. Coke just announced a supply agreement with Republic, which is one of the largest waste and recycling companies in the country. And that's something a recycler's been saying for a long time. We need long-term supply agreements,
right?
With bottlers and other folks to help stabilize the price. And we're starting to see that, and that's exciting.
That's pretty great.
What anecdotally, maybe what are some of your least favorite materials to bring in? Oh, actually, or livestock.
Yes, Mercedes knows this from the tour. Yeah, we get all kinds of interesting stuff. We've gotten live chickens and all kinds of things.
I'm sorry, how are we recycling live chickens?
I mean, you have to think about it at the end of the day, like everybody in the metropolitan area has a cart, and the cities we work with and us have invested a lot in education, but sometimes you get a live chicken.
That's fair.
Right now, one of the biggest challenges for recycling facilities is lithium batteries. So we've seen lithium batteries kind of explode in our stream. That's the greeting card that sings to you. That's a lithium battery in that greeting card, right? All our phones, power tools, etc. And
probably vape pens too, right?
Yeah. I mean, vape pens, everything. And so we've done a lot of education around not putting batteries in your recycling cart. And they still get in there. I mean, we did bus ads with our cities last year. We've done billboards, we've done mailers. But again, you're educating an entire populace. So
I feel like you need it stamped right on like the recycling cart.
It is,
and even then
you're gonna
get
there's a big battery with an X through it. And even then we get it. And lithium batteries, when they come into, I'm sure we've seen this across the country in lots of industries. If there's any pressure on those lithium batteries, they explode and cause fires. And so that's a huge issue that's facing the recycling industry. So you're hearing a lot of recyclers call for the battery manufacturers needing more responsibility in terms of the end of life of their product, because it's causing havoc for us. I'd say the other material that we really are challenged by are plastic bags and flexible packaging. And there's a lot of discussion, I'm sure you all know, about flex and film, because brands have chosen to move towards that material for a variety of reasons. It's lightweight, there's, shelf stability benefits, etc. But that material, plastic bags wrap around the shafts of our equipment. We have to shut down 2 hours a day to cut those plastic bags off, for example. Flexible packaging, the Amazon mailer or the granola pouch, right? That's going to flatten and sort in with our paper, because it's going to act like it's two-dimensional, and now it's contaminated the paper. And so, we did a study recently for the Recycling Partnership on what does it cost us just to pull that flex and film material out of our stream, just the incidental stuff. We don't want it. We educate against it, but we still get it. What does it cost to get it out? Cost us $1 a pound. If you look at recyclingmarkets.net, the value that you would get paid for MRF film and flex is a penny. So there's a really big disconnect between what it actually will cost to get that material out and what the value is in the marketplace. And so, we have a long way to go. And that's where we have to ask the questions like, yes, there may be these benefits to that packaging, but there's this cost and impact on the end of life. And we need to talk about that and how we think about that. I think one of my biggest frustrations right now is we're hearing from a lot of folks in the industry, well, there's technology out there to address the issue. And you're like, there may be technology out there to address the issue, but how much does that technology cost? And there's the market willing to pay what the capital investment and operating costs are to utilize that technology. And I think that's where there's a lot of disconnect right now.
Yeah, I can see that. And I mean, the question kind of gets pushed back on the manufacturers as well. Like, well, why don't you have the technology to move to a different material, or, design your product to make the other technology that's already there work instead of the other way around.
Yeah. So there's a lot of, I think it's a fascinating conversation, right? Like over the last 100 years, we've developed this very fast-paced consumer society with a lot of benefits, right? I mean, I know you guys are the PlastChicks, right? Like there's a lot of benefit to plastic. But the end of life is a real issue. And how we get that plastic and the impacts to frontline communities is an issue. And so we got to talk about all of those trade-offs. And so it's a complicated conversation.
Well, Kate, we're almost out of time today. But what I want to really give you a voice to a lot of our listeners who are plastics engineers or work with plastics engineers, what is your ask of us? What can we do?
I think number one, like, go visit a MRF. Go actually see what the process is and what it takes. Go visit plastic reclaimers and understand what their challenges are, right? Because the MRF is just sorting it back into PET and HDPE. And then there's the reclaimer that's flaking that and pelletizing that. Go visit and understand what the challenges are. You know, contact your local MRF. We'll give you a tour. You know, Eureka Recycling has a virtual tour on our website that people can watch.
Oh, fun.
So I think that's number one. And start having those conversations about the trade-offs, right? I mean, I think, again, there are a lot of benefits from a packaging perspective of multi-layer flex packaging, but there are real challenges in recycling it. And so I want to stop seeing people pointing fingers at each other, right? The plastic engineers need to figure this out. The recyclers need to figure this out, right? Like, we got to figure this out together.
It's just the Spider-Man meme right now. We're all
yeah. It's just a like, who should figure this out? We have to all figure it out together. So yeah, go visit a MRF. Go visit a plastics reclaimer.
I
you know, I think one of the interesting questions we're going to be continued to look at is, it's this frame that we often talk about, which is, can we versus should we, right? So like, I think green PET is a great example of this, right? Like we can sort green PET, goes in with our PET bales. We can send it to the plastics reclaimer. They recycle that into bale strapping. Which is then never going to get recycled again, right? There's no circularity around green PET. So could we look at getting green PET back into green bottles? What's the cost of that versus just getting rid of the green, right? Coke changed the Sprite bottle to be clear. So I think that's an interesting example of like, where do we do design changes and where can't we because of the properties of the packaging, and then what's the cost, right? Like, we need to wrestle that out.
Or like, what new markets can we identify or can we help build so that it is a more sustainable product and does get recycled again and again. You know?
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd really love for people to take away, and we've done a lot of research and work around this. There's a lot of talk about advanced recycling or chemical recycling kind of being the answer. And as we've dug into that issue and done our due diligence around it, like, there are a lot of different types of chemical recycling technologies, right? Like, pyrolysis is different than gasification. That's different than methanolysis. And none of those chemical recycling technologies can just take a bale of plastic waste. They all want assorted feedstock, right? The pyrolysis folks want polyethylene. They don't want PVC in there. They don't want polystyrene in there. They don't want PET because of its oxygen levels. So it still requires some level of sortation. And then it gets down to the economics. What's the cost of sorting to that technology? Is the market willing to pay for it? So that'd be the other thing, is that, like, we really need to move away from this kind of like, chemical recycling is going to solve this problem for us.
Plug your ears. Chemical recycling will do it. It's fine.
Yeah. I mean, there's been
part of the solution.
Yeah, there's been a little bit of like, it's just going to solve the problem. It could be part of the solution, but again, what are the costs associated with that? Where does it make sense? Where does it not make sense? And there's a lot of concern from frontline communities and the environmental community about the energy use for chemical recycling, the chemicals and toxicity created as a result of some of those processes. We need to talk about that. As opposed to like, this technology is just going to solve it all.
I mean, my personal favorite is plugging my ears, but
So that'd be my other one, is like, engage in the nuanced conversation around chemical recycling as opposed to just hoping that's going to solve it for.
Wonderful. Well, Kate Davenport, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciated it. I think it's gonna be really meaningful. It really changed my view on the industry visiting your facility, and gave me a much deeper understanding. So I just wildly second your recommendation for plastics engineers
and we do virtual tours for groups. So if they're packaging engineers that want to do they can't come to the Twin Cities, but they want to do a virtual tour and really dig into the issue, please go to our website and we're happy to set
I'm 100%, when I get back to work and possibly remember, I'm going to suggest it to our team.
And your website for all of our listeners
is eurekarecycling.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kate.
All right. Thank you
on
all.
a personal note too, I want to say, just because of my background and because of my family, I want to, when I was touring your facility and I'd asked you about it, you guys give ESL lessons for your employees, English as a second language, and just want to say thank you so much for doing that. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I think that's
in addition to a huge difference.
I appreciate you bringing that up, Mercedes. One of the things we've been committed to for the last 20 years is they're people that are a part of this industry. They're people that drive the trucks and sort the recycling, and recycling can't be done on the backs of them. We've done that too many times in this economy. And so, how do we make these livable paying jobs with benefits? And we've really tried to make sure that our staff are valued in the process, because if we recycle but don't value the people that do it, doesn't matter.
You just added the heart eye emoji to the end of this conversation.
So. Right, let's stop the video. I'm about to cry.
Thank you, Kate.
All right. Thanks, y'all.